Andrew Crispo. It's the mid-1980s, and he runs one of New York City's most buzzed-about art galleries, located right in the heart of the city's art scene, on East 57th Street in the iconic Fuller Building, formerly known as the Flatiron Building, home to a handful of other equally popular galleries. The Andrew Crispo Gallery sourced artwork for some of the world's wealthiest art collectors. And Crispo's openings, lavish and fun parties that were talked about long afterward, were attended by the city's elite and the celebrities of the time, including Julie Andrews, Mary Tyler Moore, Steve Martin, Mick Jagger, Jerry Hall. He rubbed shoulders with rising stars in the art world, like Douglas Abdel, and also was on the radar of the likes of Andy Warhol, Lowell Nesbitt, and Charles Selinger. Coming from almost nothing, he was an orphan raised in a Philadelphia orphanage. His story had a shiny, rags-to-riches tone to it, until February of 1985, when he committed his most stunning act, one of a string of backroom, secretive, underhanded, and sadistic deeds he had been doing his whole life under the radar, with people either choosing to look the other way or that he kept so well hidden that most, except for his inner circle, didn't even know about. This is the story of a man who decided the rules didn't apply to him, or is it? This is Eigil Dag Vesti. When this story blew up in the spring of 1985, Crispo's name was everywhere. He was well known in New York City, and his subculture lifestyle coming to light was fascinating for many, who were equally intrigued and horrified by him. But Eigil Vesti seems to be overshadowed by the shocking events of this story, and he shouldn't be. Because of his path crossing Crispo's, he paid with the ultimate price, his life. Vesti was a student at the Fashion Institute of Technology and lived in New York City, which it turned out were two dreams he had held since he was a little boy. So, where did it all go wrong? How did he go from living his dream life to becoming an unwitting part of New York City's biggest art world scandal? In today's video, that's exactly what we're going to find out. By the way, my name is Jamie Lee, and here on my channel, I focus on art, either doing it or talking about it. I have time-lapse painting videos, videos about using a light box, and videos like this one, where I talk about strange or interesting tales from the art world. I have my different styles of videos organized into playlists so you can easily find what you are looking for. If that all sounds good to you, you can do all the things. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell to be notified when I upload new videos. That's enough of that. Let's get to today's story. Eigil Dag Vesti grew up in Oslo, Norway, and as I previously mentioned, he knew from a very early age that he wanted two things in life: to have a fashion career and to live in New York City. By the way, I've heard his name pronounced Eigil, Eigil. I've looked it up myself, and there's not really a consensus on how to pronounce it. I'm going with Eigil for this video. He traveled to the United States at age 17 as an exchange student and spent a year attending high school in Kalamazoo, Michigan, around 1974 or 75. It is largely suspected that it was during this experience abroad that he discovered another thing. Eigil grew certain that he was gay. His family members believe that he had some experience or experiences during his trip abroad that solidified this understanding he had about his sexuality, since he came out to both of his sisters shortly after returning to Norway after his year abroad. One sister, Anne Margaret, unconditionally supported him, while the other, Tony, wasn't happy about the news, but wasn't against him either. He decided not to tell his parents because they were both in their late 70s, and I'm assuming it was either because he felt like they wouldn't support him or that they just wouldn't understand. I mean, after all, his parents would have been born around the turn of the century. His dream in starting his fashion career was to attend the Fashion Institute of Technology, a small but prestigious college located in West Manhattan. It seems like this would be the perfect place for Eigil. But his first application in 1981 was rejected because he didn't do well on the English exam, which seems kind of weird because he spent a year abroad in the United States. So, anyway, so his father a former Norwegian ship captain, helped get him a job as a sales clerk aboard the Saga Fjord, a 5-star plus luxury ocean liner. This proved to be a blessing in disguise, for aboard this ship was a passenger who was well known in the men's fashion world in California, and he was so impressed with the charming and handsome crew member with a dream in the fashion industry that he called his friend when the ship docked, a friend who happened to work for the FIT, to put in a good word for Eigil's admission. It worked, and he was accepted in February of 1982. Once at FIT, Eigil was on the radar. Being gay was nothing unusual, as most of the male population at FIT was. But Eigil was more than a foreigner who happened to be gay. He was memorable, he had style, he was handsome in a unique way, and he dressed to impress always. He was very skinny, with white blonde hair and deep blue eyes. But when he put on an outfit, he carried himself in such a way that others took notice. And he always wore cowboy boots. He was quite literally the talk of the school, because his sense of fashion was so far ahead of others. The problem came when people tried to get to know him. It might have been a language barrier problem, but many complained that Eigil just didn't have much to say. He would smile all the time, but conversing with others was just not his strong suit. His looks made a huge splash, but what was described as his lack of personality left people a bit uncomfortable. Sadly, at some point in Eigil's path to his dream career, he seemed to falter, according to some who knew him quite well, including a former roommate who watched his decline from start to almost finish. After attending FIT for almost 3 years, he started to lose focus of the path that he was on. Something or someone negatively influenced Eigil, to the point some said he was like 2 different people. Is it a coincidence that this lined up with an alleged friendship with a new powerful friend? A friend who many who knew them claimed was Andrew Crispo? Let's talk about him. Andrew John Crispo was born in 1945 and grew up in St. John's Orphanage in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. As the story went, Andrew's mother brought him there as a newborn. She was 16, unmarried, and Italian, and according to the family court judge, his father was French. Years later, Andrew was given the chance to meet his birth mother, and he said, quote, "I didn't feel like knocking on my mother's door," unquote. Andrew knew very early on that he was gay, and he was neither shy about it nor in the habit of sticking to one partner. In fact, as he became an adult and left the orphanage and began making his way around Philly and on to New York City, he cultivated short encounters, like one-night stands, long-term relationships, and beneficial sugar daddy-style affairs, all at the same time. He did not seem to become attached to people in the way many do, possibly, in my opinion, due to his circumstances as a child and young adult. Let's say early on he learned to do things his way, with little regard for the fallout for any person involved other than himself. He moved fast and moved on faster. Career-wise, despite a total lack of experience with the art world, Andrew landed a job working as a gallery assistant in 1967. He explained to Irma Rudin, an employee at the ACA Gallery in New York, that the one bright spot about the horrible orphanage he grew up in was that they had taken him to museums, and he had developed a love of art. And according to Sidney Bergen, the gallery's founder and owner, it didn't matter that Andrew was inexperienced, because he was charming and he knew how to sell. This combination of traits that he sharpened at the ACA Gallery for the 5 years that he worked there was the pathway for Andrew's rise to New York fame and wealth. However, if this were just a heartwarming rags to riches story of a young boy from an orphanage making his fortune in the art world, I would probably not be making this video. To say that Andrew built his career his own way, with countless backroom deals, stepping on those beneath him, and screwing over people to advance himself, would be an understatement. It seems Andrew would sell almost anyone down the river to benefit himself. And don't get me wrong, it did benefit. By 1984, after operating the Andrew Crispo Gallery for about 10 years, Andrew was 40 and had a personal wealth of $50 million. He opened his gallery somewhere in 1972, starting off with loans from wealthy patrons and acquaintances, which he did pay back. He rented the biggest space available in the Fuller Building at a rate of $6,000 a month, with help from Arthur Smith, the noted interior designer, and Andrew's apartment mate, and his sugar daddy / lover. The space was turned into a showplace, much like Andrew's half of the apartment, as you can see here. These are some photos of how Arthur Smith had decorated Andrew's apartment to give him, the look of luxury. The gallery was much the same. The oversized front doors, reminiscent of Italy, were special ordered and finished with brass fittings. Each room was a different color and purpose. The main gallery had white walls. The green room had a couch and a blank wall, so high-end clients could sit and study potential purchases. Andrew's office was the red room, and yes, probably was that kind of red room. If you know, you know. And it also held a Louis XVI desk purchased for $9,000. Remember, this was back in the early 80s. Over the years, Andrew's gallery sold art to some of the wealthiest art collectors in the world. He had even managed to establish a personal relationship with who was considered to be the world's most famous and wealthiest art collector of the time, Baron Hans Heinrich von Thyssen-Bornemisza, or as Andrew and the Baron's closest friends and family called him, Heine, who bought more than 400 artworks, totaling more than $90 million in gross receipts from Crispo's gallery. But despite his legitimate outward-seeming success, Andrew had more tricks up his sleeve during those 10 years than a street magician. He spied on his employees. He falsified records for tax avoidance purposes. He sold paintings that belonged to other people, or dealers. He held grudges and punished people who he felt did him dirty. There are too many examples of this for me to list them all out, but I will mention a couple of them so you can get an idea of what the real Andrew Crispo was like. He kept his gallery employees under tight surveillance. The phones were tapped. There were recording devices all over the gallery. As some employees told, there were piles of recorded cassettes everywhere. He kept secret files stored in a separate location on employees, acquaintances, and business associates. His focus on making a sale knew no boundaries. Once, he had actor Steve Martin in his gallery, looking to purchase art in the early 1980s, and Andrew asked one of his gallery assistants to bring out a Franz Klein from the storage room. It was in fact not in a storage room, but in another dealer's showroom upstairs. The assistant borrowed it on consignment and brought it down. Then Andrew sold it to Steve Martin, who appeared with the painting on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine, wearing a matching suit, not fazed in the least that he had just paid a markup on the piece of near $50,000 just for Crispo selling it to him. In another example, in a twisted, years-long saga, Andrew Crispo screwed over one of his good friends, Marty Ackerman, who loaned Crispo $423,000, and in return took ownership of nearly 24 paintings as collateral from Andrew's personal art collections, including a Picasso and Andrew's prized Georgia O'Keeffe paintings. One day, Andrew just stopped paying back the money he borrowed, and Ackerman spent 2 years trying to chase Andrew down. Finally, they tried to work out a deal, but it went south quickly, with Andrew flipping out and rage threatening to sue Marty for stealing his art, which he did sue him. But then he showed up to court nearly in contempt, coked out of his mind, and the whole thing was eventually thrown out. All of these instances show the spiral of a man teetering on the edge of madness. And we haven't even talked about the gay sex clubs yet. Once Andrew was in New York City, He worked hard and played hard. The gay club scene was growing, with many underground clubs offering any experience a person could dream up, and I do mean any. The Hellfire Club, Limelight, the Mine Shaft, and other gay clubs were Andrew Crispo's playground. He frequented all the clubs, prowling for young men in a haze of cocaine and alcohol, setting up encounters with just himself or with a small group of street thugs or his personal acquaintances for meetups involving S&M, bondage, and sex play, and, according to many, more frequently darker torture and pain fantasies. Andrew had zero boundaries or empathy for others. Many who were involved in encounters with Andrew genuinely feared for their lives afterward. To him, they were nothing more than living mannequins or sex dolls. It was within this sex torture fantasy life that the paths of Andrew Crispo and Eigil Dag Vesti crossed, and it would bring about the end to one life and the end of an era to the other. Eigil and Andrew met sometime in 1983. Between that time and his death, Eigil's downward spiral was in full swing. Unknown to his parents, he had practically dropped out of FIT, even though they kept sending him money for his studies. He had fallen into a lifestyle of drugs and frequenting gay clubs in New York City, placing the importance of these two activities above everything else in his life. According to one person who knew Eigil and roomed with him for quite some time, he no longer took care of himself and went from looking like a striking Nordic model to looking like a haggard, sick ghost of his former self. He was clubbing constantly, stopped paying rent, stopped going to classes, and became caught up in the glittering fantasy world he saw without realizing or understanding the darkness it hid. In short, he became the perfect prey for a man like Andrew Crispo. But Andrew had a little help. And this is where we meet the fall guy, Andrew's right-hand man, more like his henchman, Bernard LeGeros. By all accounts, Bernard was not gay, and in fact many acquaintances of Bernard's and Andrew's knew that he spoke of and to gay people with an almost venomous hatred. He met Andrew first, briefly, in December of 1977 at the age of 15, and then again years later in 1982, when LeGeros happened to go to Andrew's gallery to ask for his help in job searching. It seems that initial meeting with Andrew had made quite an impression on teenage Bernard. As he said years later in an interview while he was incarcerated, quote, "He was an orphan, and I admired the way he came up from that to be as successful as he was. And he was very successful," unquote. From that point on, Bernard became a part of Andrew's fast-paced high life. Parties and limousines, S&M meetups, and increasingly, cocaine. Mountains, literally, of cocaine. In 1984, Andrew offered Bernard a job, working for Andrew at his gallery. But it was more like Bernard worked as Andrew's personal tough guy. He would do Andrew's bidding willingly, whether it be roughing up a person who slighted Andrew, handling Andrew's secret business and tax files, or passing along specific information from Andrew to personal acquaintances or business associates. Crispo would jokingly refer to him as, quote, "my executioner," or "my bodyguard," and Bernard truly was. So, who was Bernard? Bernard came to the city from Rockland County, New York. His family was originally settled in a farmhouse property on Buckbirk Mountain Road in Tompkins Cove, New York. But their demanding careers decided that the family would be world travelers for much of Bernard's youth, although they kept the Buckbirk property as kind of a second or summer home, while also maintaining an apartment on Manhattan's East Side in New York City. Bernard's mother, Dr. Raquel LeGeros, was a research scientist who was an expert on calcium phosphates, and she traveled extensively lecturing on scientific papers she had written. And Bernard's father was a physicist who accepted an executive position with the United Nations Development Program, administering aid to third world countries. despite coming from a family that obviously prized intellect. Bernard was very troubled from the beginning. According to Raquel, who was Filipina and was highly focused on proving herself career-wise, maybe a little too focused, she later lamented. Quote, John and I were trying very hard in our own careers. Maybe too hard. We really wanted the best for our children, to give them a better start in life. Unquote. However, their lifestyle was pretty hard on their oldest son from a very early age. And the fact that he spent large chunks of his childhood away from his parents created a big impact on him. He was sent to stay with a nurse in Yonkers for 5 days a week as an infant, and then sent to the Philippines to stay with relatives for a year when he was 14 months old. At age 13, he was enrolled in the Pierrepont School in Great Britain, while his father served in the UN in Yemen, and his mother remained in New York. Bernard absolutely hated it, and begged to be allowed to leave. And eventually his parents relented, and allowed him to live in Yemen with his father and brother for a while. All of the instability of his childhood had a big impact on Bernard mentally. At 18, in 1980, he slashed his wrists. In 1982, he attempted to poison himself with cyanide, and he was also admitted twice to Bellevue Hospital in Manhattan, and released when his father promised to get him a psychiatrist. But at that point, Bernard was beyond the reach of his parents. A situation he said in a later interview he doesn't blame them for. He said, quote, I did feel rejected and alone, but they were trying to do their best all along. I don't blame them. They tend to blame themselves. What happened to me, happened to me. Crispo saw that I was vulnerable, and he took advantage. But I feel sorry for what I've done to my family, not what any of them have done to me. Unquote. So here we have three people, Andrew, Eigil, and Bernard. Andrew, at the top of his professional game, but with things secretly falling apart due to bad financial decisions and a literal ass ton of cocaine. Bernard, an angry, brutal young man who had no real focus in life at that point other than Andrew. And of course, almost as much cocaine as Andrew was taking, which only seemed to increase his anxious rage tendencies. And then we have Eigil, a man who came to New York City with such promise, but fell victim to the scene. All glitter, no substance. All three men were falling apart. And at the end of this story, one would be dead, one imprisoned, and one eventually imprisoned, but not for the reason you'd think. The story about the night Eigil died is a little all over the place, but the best that authorities could piece together is this. On Friday, February 22nd, 1985, Andrew was doing his usual, cruising the bar scene, looking for someone to play with. The night started at the Hellfire, with Bernard and one of his friends, Billy Mayer, along, and then on to the Limelight. While in the ride to that club, the talk turned to murder. Yes, but specific murder. Andrew brought up the idea of killing one of the Limelight's managers, a man named Freddie. There was some beef between an acquaintance of Andrew's and Bernard's with the manager, and they had discussed a few times some possible revenge plots, bringing him upstate and tying him to a tree and whipping him, but that was dismissed because, quote, he'd probably enjoy it. Somehow, revenge turned to murder, and the three men in the car decided tonight would be the night to grab Freddie, drive him upstate, and kill him. I know what you might be thinking. Number one, what the hell? And number two, this has nothing to do with Eigil. Don't worry, we'll get to that. So they hung out at a VIP room at the Limelight with Freddie as their personal table service and tried to talk him into going with them, but he refused. Must be that, staying alive intuition people have. He was working and he wouldn't leave. After several unsuccessful hours, Andrew told Billy and Bernard to go take a break and he would attempt one last time. For their break, Bernard took Billy to get his baby, a dismantled AR-7 rifle in a black nylon bag. Then they headed to the agreed meeting place, but Andrew wasn't there. The doorman at the Hellfire told them Andrew had already left with a thin, younger man. They found Andrew at his apartment with Eigil, and Andrew was clearly in the mood to mess around a bit because he told Bernard that Eigil was, quote, a friend of Sam Collins, unquote. A significant statement because Andrew had spent previously a considerable amount of time whipping up an extreme hatred within Bernard for this Sam Collins guy for whatever reason. Possibly just because Andrew thought it was a fun joke or a game. There really was no actual reason. So, as soon as Bernard heard Andrew say this, he seemed to have an extra bit of venom for Eigil, which Andrew seemed to be purposefully stoking. Around 5 a.m., Bernard returned Billy to his home and then went back to Andrew's, where Eigil Vesti was now kneeling in the foyer, wearing a black leather bondage hood with a zippered mouth, and was handcuffed with his arms in front of him. It was after this that Andrew and Bernard discussed what to do with Eigil, and still the plan to kill someone seemed to be in the front of both of their minds. The plan to kill Freddie, the club manager, hadn't gone anywhere, so Eigil seemed to be the fill-in. They agreed to drive Eigil upstate, with Andrew telling Bernard to make sure his bag of toys was in the car. Andrew was rather well known for having various sex toys stored in a black nylon bag. So, that morning of the 23rd now, they left the city and drove to Bernard's family home on Buckburn Mountain Road with their mark, Eigil, who, by all accounts, didn't seem the least bit uncomfortable with this turn of events, plus Bernard's AR-7, plus Andrew's bag of sex toys. According to Bernard, quote, it started out as one of Andrew's games, a game he'd played many times before. I thought it would be just that. I never believed until it was too late that it would go as far as it did, unquote.
Vesti, he insists, was not an unwilling passenger on the ride to Rockland County. He and Andrew were into their thing, Bernard stated. Vesti thought it was all a game, too. The events, as the police were able to later piece together, went something like this. The three men spent the trip passing around wine and cocaine. Don't ask me who was driving, because there was only 3 of them, and it wasn't Eigil, so... Once they arrived at the LeGeros country home, Bernard let them in, and they made their way to the living room, where Andrew and Eigil sat on a couch facing a large bay window where they could see the sun rising over the Hudson River. However, instead of relaxing and enjoying the view,
as I'm thinking some people might do, Andrew laid out lines of coke on the glass coffee table and passed around more wine, as he and Bernard discussed the gun in front of an either oblivious or coked out of his mind Eigil Vesti. Eigil even watched curiously as Bernard took the dismantled gun from the bag and began to piece it together while Eigil asked questions about it. Bernard then opened the door and shot out into the yard, pretending he might have hit a deer. Eventually, Bernard coaxed them all outside after Andrew and Eigil had a little playtime session in another part of the house, hoping to prove to them that they might find a deer shot somewhere in the woods because he was such a great shot from the door of his house. They all made their way past the tennis courts and toward a small stone smokehouse that dated from like the Revolutionary War period. So this was where Eigil, wearing the black S&M mask, was knelt down in the mud with his hands cuffed behind his back. He was wearing no pants, but he did have on his beloved cowboy boots and a green coat. Bernard and Andrew bickered back and forth while Eigil passively waited, seemingly having no indication of what was to come, still thinking he was part of some sex fantasy game of Andrew's. Andrew egged Bernard on more, trying to basically stoke his rage by having Eigil tell Bernard that he had earlier called him a wimp. Andrew also did more cocaine. Then, in a scenario police believe Andrew set up and controlled from beginning to end, Andrew said the words that would end an innocent man's life. He told Bernard, quote, "He is ready now. He wants to die. Shoot him," unquote. Which Bernard then did, twice, in the back of the head. Bernard later stated that Crispo was in charge of this detail too. Crispo had told him to shoot Vesti twice, once to kill his body and once to kill his soul. With Eigil dead, the 2 men removed the rest of his clothes and the handcuffs. but kept Eigil in the boots and the mask. They put him in the smokehouse and went to gather gasoline and logs and set fire to his body. Then Andrew wiped away any fingerprints, both inside and outside the house, and then both men drove back to New York City, with Andrew throwing various items out the windows as they went. A t-shirt here, a jockstrap there. They even stopped near a storm drain along the way and attempted to stuff an enormous toy used on Eigil into the grate, but it wouldn't fit. So they just left it there, partially hanging out, where later a park maintenance worker found it, fished it out, and brought it back to the office, where his coworkers drew a face on it, gave it a necktie, and displayed it on the boss's file cabinet. All 14 inches and 8 pounds of it, where police conducting the investigation later had to confiscate it, photograph it, and put it to evidence. I'm speechless. So now we arrive at March 17th, 1985. It had been 22 days since Andrew and Bernard had returned to New York City, back to their everyday lives, almost as though nothing had happened. Bernard actually told several people he had killed a man, but for some odd reason, nobody believed him. They dismissed it as him telling stories or exaggerating to seem like more of a macho thug than he already was. Meanwhile, posters hung around the city attached to telephone poles with a modeling photo of Eigil Dag Vesti. Have you seen this man? No one had. He seemed to have disappeared without a trace. It was on this day, March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, 1985, that 5 boys in Stony Point, New York, headed out into the woods near 2 of the boys' home for an afternoon adventure. They were buzzing with excitement about what they might find or stumble upon in the forest, but I'm guessing it wasn't a burned-out body inside a cave-like stone structure, but that's exactly what they stumbled across when the youngest of the group had to go pee. Suddenly, New York City's seedy underside and the rest of the world collided, because soon after they reported what they had found, the case blew up in the media. It took a couple of days to put together the missing New York fashion student and the body in the smokehouse, but soon the connection was made. Eigil was wearing a small gold ring that was eventually identified by his sister and Margaret. And also the S&M hood actually preserved the upper half of his face, while the rest of his body had been burned or, sadly, foraged by animals. It's hard to say what most captivated the nation about this case. It might have been Andrew's rumored involvement, because his outward image was of a wealthy, successful art gallery owner. It might have been that the door had been ripped open to a whole world many people knew absolutely nothing about. Gay sex clubs, S&M, bondage, torture, and that the glittering nightlife of New York City could be so cruel. Or it might, sadly, be the gruesome details that were splashed across front page news. Eigil's remains were described in great detail, and the photos of the corpse and the remains of his skull and the mask can easily be found. It's almost as though very few people had regarded him as a once living, breathing human, and he had been reduced to somewhat of a circus sideshow freak. It's very obvious, in my opinion at least, that of those investigating the murder, that Andrew Crispo was seen as the true mastermind behind the murder of Eigil Vesti. He pushed Bernard to the limit and kept him on edge, with heckling by others and a Mount Everest of cocaine running through his body, literally at all times. He set up the whole murder. But why? By many accounts of people who knew Andrew, Eigil was somewhat of a friend who Andrew had known for more than a year. It had been reported and was even quoted by some of the authorities in the case that Eigil was just some random dude that he picked up in a club. But he was not some random dude Crispo picked up in a bar That's what makes the situation so much more horrifying. A man who is in Andrew Crispo's close circle for many years, named Sam Collins, the one he used to bait Bernard back at the murder scene, he had dated Andrew briefly in 1977, and they remained friends until they had a falling out not too long before all of this happened. And Sam had met Eigil in 1983. And they dated until about 1984. He told authorities when they tracked him down and interviewed him that he introduced Eigil to Andrew at a fundraiser in the fall of 1983, which means that in February of 1985, Andrew had known Eigil for almost 2 years. Sam recalled Andrew and Eigil had attended the same Christmas party and hung out at clubs together. This was the former boyfriend of an ex-boyfriend of Andrew's, and he seemed to have no care or regard for him as a human being. He was just a play toy. And Andrew was the one, by all accounts, who said to Bernard, "Shoot him. He wants to die." You may be surprised to learn that Andrew was never jailed for Eigil's murder. He was never tried or convicted. Hell, he was never even arrested. Bernard was arrested, however, and he was put on trial for Eigil's murder in September of 1985, which, coincidentally, the other thing that happened in September of 1985 in New York City, I also did a video on, and I will link that up here for you if you're interested. It was the possible murder of artist Anna Mendieta, who fell or was pushed out a window in September of 1985. So these two stories were kind of going on around the same time frame, which I found interesting. Maybe you do too. Andrew was subpoenaed, but on his day in court, he repeatedly pled the 5th and 14th Amendments to not incriminate himself. That was it. Bernard's jury returned a verdict after only 2.5 hours of deliberation. After the judge warned them before going into the room that they were under imminent threat of Hurricane Gloria that day as they began their deliberations. And it seems everybody was under the impression that Andrew's case would come next, but it never did. The jury quickly found Bernard guilty, and the sentence was 25 years to life. Bernard was paroled on January 3rd, 2019, from Attica after 33 years in prison at age 56.
The murder happened behind the estate of a Rockland County, in Rockland County, and sent shockwaves around the country.
And as Nightside Sarah Tolan tells us, that murder may actually still be unsolved.
It was a sadistic killing with no other motive.
A sadomasochistic murder in this Rockland County country home that sent shockwaves around the world.
It shocked everyone involved in the art community and cafe society in New York.
Now, the killer in the infamous 1985 death mask murder case is finally free. On Wednesday, Bernard LeGeros was released on parole after serving 33 years for shooting 26-year-old Norwegian model Eigil Dag Vesti at his family's Stony Point estate, all with the alleged help of Manhattan's biggest art mogul at the time, Andrew Crispo. Gribbets saying LeGeros shot Dag Vesti after luring him with Crispo from a New York City gay club up to the state off Buckburg Road. The pair then allegedly burning the body and dumping it behind the home. The only thing left of the decomposed corpse for authorities to ID was the victim's face, preserved by the leather S&M mask he was wearing.
They would have gotten away with murder literally if he did not have that death mask.
LeGeros took the fall while Crispo walked free.
There was no other corroborative evidence whatsoever.
He admitted in a Vanity Fair interview that he had been under Andrew's influence for many years, dazzled by his lifestyle and blinded by loyalty to the older man. But he seems to have taken responsibility for his role in Eigil's death. He said of Andrew, quote, "I used to think he was my friend. I thought he was great to me. He was beaten at that orphanage. And I think he kept reliving it with all that S&M stuff. His loyalty to Andrew abruptly ended when he was arrested and told investigators that he had been with Crispo and not near his family home that fateful night. When Crispo heard this, he responded that, quote, he wouldn't be a part of Bernard's alibi, unquote. Bernard wrote while in prison, "I am overwhelmed with sorrow for what I have done to them." To rephrase what Pablo Neruda once wrote, "For from each crime were born the bullets that have this day found within me where my heart lies." Andrew was never arrested in this case, because police had no corroborating witnesses that could prove his guilt. And in New York, the uncorroborated testimony of a confessed accomplice can't be used as the sole evidence. And authorities just seemed to feel there wasn't enough evidence otherwise to bring about a conviction, said the assistant DA after a grand jury investigating Crispo was dismissed, quote, "Without proof, they can't win a case," unquote. Ironically, just a few months after Bernard's sentencing, Andrew was sent to prison for tax evasion. He began his sentence on January 27, 1986, and put his prized personal collection of artwork up for auction, cashing in on $20 million in artwork, despite only auctioning a third of his collection. In July of 1989, he was released after only about 3.5 years. His friend and former apartment mate, lover / whatever, Arthur Smith, had wanted to surprise Andrew by redecorating Crispo's other home, his beloved estate in Southampton. But karma may have been lurking in the background, because 2 weeks after Andrew's release, possibly before he had even had a chance to see the new decor, Andrew Crispo's house exploded. Yes, exploded. 3 explosions in all. Blew the roof off and leveled his 2-story house, stuffed full of millions of dollars of artwork. The explosions were followed by an intense fire, and in the end, only the chimney remained. What caused the explosion? According to the Long Island Lighting Company, a gas leak under the concrete patio was the cause, and it was officially ruled an accident. Andrew sued for $10 million and ended up receiving about $8.5 million in compensation. One close friend of Andrew's said of the explosion, quote, "It was a punishment greater than anything he might have gotten in the Vesti case. Losing that house and all those paintings inside was the worst thing that could have ever happened to Andrew. It was his favorite possession. It was justice," unquote. Whether or not that's true is debatable, but Andrew was sent to prison again, this time for 11 years, for a 2000 conviction for plotting to kidnap the daughter of an attorney. Crispo had been acquitted in 1988 of torturing another man during a drug-fueled party at the art gallery in 1984. And that is the story of the death mask murder, one of the art world's most notorious and sensational cases. I would love to hear your thoughts below. Do you think Andrew's house exploding was an accident, or some kind of karmic or revenge retribution? Do you believe they should have brought him to trial for Eigil's murder, despite the fact that they didn't have evidence? Leave me a comment and like and share this video if you enjoyed hearing this crazy tale. I'm so glad you spent some of your valuable time watching my video, and I will see you back here one day soon with another fascinating story. By the way, if you are interested, you can stay tuned after the credits because I have a new puppy and I will show you her. So stay tuned for that, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye! This is